The moment her boss handed her the cheap card, the whole room went silent, but not for the reason he expected. Linnea, a woman who had poured 30 years of her life into preserving the delicate, crumbling ghosts of history, was being dismissed with a flimsy piece of cardstock signed by people who barely knew her name. And watching it all from the shadows at the back of the magnificent gallery was Caius Thorne, a man who owned the building, a man who owned most of the city, a man whispered to be older than the city itself. But what no one in that room of smirking colleagues and corporate climbers understood was that for the first time in 500 years, he was seeing a treasure he could not buy, but one he would absolutely claim. If you believe that a lifetime of being invisible can end in a single moment of being truly seen, type "seen" below and let me tell you what happened next. It started on a night when the city glittered like a field of broken glass, and the air held the cold, wet promise of late autumn rain. For 30 years, Linnea had been the quiet heart of the Abril Museum's conservation department. She was a paper and manuscript specialist, a woman with hands so steady and a touch so gentle she could coax secrets from parchment that threatened to turn to dust if you breathed on it too hard. She had saved illuminated manuscripts from the brink of oblivion, stabilized letters written by forgotten queens, and pieced together journals that were the only remaining voice of a person long dead. Her work was her life. It was a silent, devoted conversation with the past. And now it was over. The museum had been acquired by a new conglomerate, and the new director, a man named Julian Croft, with a smile as bright and empty as a polished skull, had decided her position was redundant, a cost-saving measure. He had announced it in a sterile email, and this party was the final public humiliation. A farewell toast to the woman they were pushing out the door. They held it in the museum's new acquisitions wing, a cavernous space of white marble and glass that felt more like a mausoleum for money than a home for art. The wing was sponsored by and leased from Thorne Industries. Its enigmatic head, Caius Thorne, was rumored to attend these functions occasionally, a silent panther surveying his territory. Linnea had never seen him. He was a myth, a name on a building. Julian Croft stood on a small, portable dais, a champagne flute in his hand. He was talking about the future, about synergy and dynamic growth. He used Linnea's departure as a pivot point, a symbol of the museum's bold new direction. He said, "We are so grateful for Linnea's many years of quiet dedication." The word quiet landed like a stone, a synonym for invisible, for unimportant. And as a token of our immense appreciation for her 3 decades of service, we have this. He held up the card. It was from a corner pharmacy, Linnea could tell. It had a picture of a sunset on it. Generic, thoughtless. Inside, she knew, would be a dozen scrawled signatures from people in accounting and marketing she'd never met. The polite, strained applause started. People clapped because they were supposed to. Linnea felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mix of pity and relief that it was her, not them. Her hands, usually so steady, felt cold and numb at her sides. She had imagined this moment, dreaded it. She had promised herself she would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She walked toward the dais, her sensible black shoes making no sound on the polished marble. Each step was a small death. 30 years. 30 years of breathing life into the fragile remnants of other people's lives, and her own was being erased with a greeting card. She took it from Julian's outstretched hand. The cardstock felt slick and cheap. She looked at his face, at the self-satisfied glint in his eyes. He expected her to scurry away, to fade into the background one last time. And she opened her mouth. She hadn't planned to speak. The words just came, quiet but clear, cutting through the murmuring of the crowd. "Thank you, Julian," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "May I say one thing?" He was taken aback, but the performance of magnanimity was crucial. He gestured grandly. "Of course, Linnea. The floor is yours." She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the wall behind Julian, at a newly acquired piece. It was a single vellum page displayed in a climate-controlled case, a fragment from a 15th century herbalist's text. Julian had boasted about acquiring it at a recent auction. "That page," Linnea said, her voice resonating with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from her. "The Verili fragment. You have the lighting wrong." A gasp rippled through the room. Julian's smile froze on his face. "The UV filters on these lamps are inadequate for iron gall ink, especially one with such a vitriol content," she continued, her tone conversational, clinical. "In 6 months, the ink will begin to ghost. In a year, it will start to flake. In 5 years, this page, which has survived for 600 years, will be illegible. You're killing it." The silence in the room was no longer polite. It was absolute. It was shocked. Julian's face was a mask of fury. He had been publicly corrected. His prize acquisition shown to be endangered by his own incompetence. And from the back of the room, a voice spoke. It was low and resonant, a sound like stones grinding together deep underground. "Is that true?" Every head turned. A figure detached itself from the deep shadows near the far wall. He moved with a liquid grace that was unnerving in its silence. Tall, dressed in a black suit that seemed woven from night itself, Caius Thorne stepped into the light. He wasn't handsome in the way of movie stars. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, a sculpture carved from pale, unforgiving stone. His hair was black. His eyes were a shade of dark that seemed to drink the light from the room. A palpable cold emanated from him, and the air grew still and heavy. Julian sputtered. "Mr. Thorne, we were just—" Caius Thorne's gaze was not on Julian. It was fixed entirely on Linnea. He had moved closer, and she could feel the temperature drop by several degrees. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to stretch toward him. He repeated the question, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "Is what you said true?" Linnea met his gaze. His eyes were unnerving, ancient. It felt like looking into a deep well. But she was not afraid. She had spent her life with ghosts. This man was just more solid than most. "Yes," she said simply. "The half-life of the ink is measurable. The decay is a chemical certainty." He tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement. A flicker of something that was not quite surprise, not quite amusement, crossed his features. It was interest. Pure, undivided interest. He took another silent step forward, stopping directly in front of her. He was so still he barely seemed to breathe. He looked from her face to the cheap card still clutched in her hand. Then he turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over Julian Croft and the stunned board members. "You are letting this woman go?" His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of utter disbelief. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. Julian found his voice, slick with panic. "She's at retirement age, Mr. Thorne. We're modernizing. New blood." "You're a fool," Caius Thorne said. The words were not shouted. They were delivered like a death sentence, cold and final. The room's ambient temperature seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. The lights overhead flickered once, twice. He turned his attention back to Linnea. His eyes, she saw now, were not just dark. In their depths, a faint, impossible crimson swirled like wine in a dark glass. "I have a collection," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Of paper, of manuscripts. Some are delicate. They are failing. I require an expert, not a modernist, a master." He held out a hand. His fingers were long and pale. Not a handshake, an invitation. "Your employment at this institution is terminated," he stated, looking directly at Julian, who flinched as if struck. "Your new employment begins now, with me. Your salary is quadrupled. You will have unlimited resources and absolute authority over the collection. My car is waiting." Linnea stared at him, at his outstretched hand. The room had ceased to exist. The shocked faces, Julian's apoplectic rage, the pathetic card in her hand. It all faded into a dull, distant hum. There was only this man, his impossible stillness, his ancient eyes, and the sudden, breathtaking offer of not just a job, but of value, of being seen. After a lifetime of being overlooked, of being quiet, this man had looked at her and seen a master. She let the greeting card fall from her fingers. It fluttered to the marble floor, a splash of meaningless color in a room that had suddenly become hers to command. She placed her hand in his. His skin was not just cool, it was cold. A deep, profound cold, like stone pulled from the heart of a winter mountain. But it was not a dead cold. It was alive, thrumming with a stillness that felt like coiled power. "All right," she whispered. Caius Thorne's fingers closed around hers. It was not a grip of possession, but of reception. A confirmation. He gave a single, sharp nod, and without another word, turned and led her from the room. The crowd parted for them like the sea before a prophet. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe. They walked past a sputtering Julian Croft, past her stunned former colleagues, out of the gallery, and into the night. The glass doors slid open before them, and a long black car idled at the curb, its engine a low, predatory purr. A driver held the door open. Caius guided her inside, his hand a cool, steady pressure at the small of her back. The door closed, encasing them in a world of silent, fragrant leather and tinted glass. The city lights slid past, blurred and distant. She sat on the plush seat, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a wild, terrifying thrill. She had just walked away from her entire life and into the car of a man who felt like a legend come to life. A man some of the older archivists, in hushed, fanciful tones, had once referred to as the city's own vampire king, a joke about his nocturnal habits and ancient wealth. He did not speak. He simply sat opposite her, his stillness a palpable force in the enclosed space. The shadows in the car seemed to deepen around him, to cling to the sharp tailoring of his suit. He watched her, his crimson-flecked eyes holding an unreadable, centuries-old patience. The car drove for a long time, leaving the glittering heart of the city behind, heading toward the old, wooded hills that overlooked the metropolis. The rain began to fall, slicking the roads to black mirrors, each drop tracing a path down Linnea's window. Finally, The car turned through a set of immense, wrought-iron gates that swung open without a guard in sight. They drove up a long, winding drive, the headlights cutting a swath through a forest of ancient oaks. At the top of the hill, a house emerged from the mist and darkness. It was not a house. It was a fortress of modern architecture, all glass and dark steel and clean brutalist lines. Yet it had the soul of a Gothic cathedral. It clung to the cliffside, a series of interconnected cubes and sweeping glass walls that stared out at the sprawling city lights below. One entire wing was older, a restored stone edifice that seemed out of place, a piece of the past grafted onto the present. The car slid to a halt under a stark, cantilevered portico. The driver opened her door. Caius was already out, waiting for her, the fine mist of rain not daring to touch him. He led her inside. The interior was vast, silent, and cold. The floors were polished black concrete. The walls were acres of glass or stark white plaster, hung with art that made the Abril Museum's collection look like a child's scribbles. A Rothko here, a de Kooning there, each given its own wall, its own space to breathe. But he did not lead her to these galleries. He led her toward the old stone wing. The air grew colder as they walked down a long, echoing corridor. The sound of their footsteps was the only noise. He stopped before a set of heavy oak doors bound in iron. He placed his hand on a biometric panel beside it, and with a soft hiss and a heavy clunk, ancient bolts slid back. He pushed the doors open and gestured for her to enter. Linnea stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a library. But it was a library in the way a black hole is a star. 2 stories high, walled with dark, carved wood from floor to ceiling, crammed with books and scrolls and leather-bound folios. A spiral staircase of wrought iron led to a second-level mezzanine that wrapped around the entire room. The air smelled of old paper, of leather, of beeswax, and of something else. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. But it wasn't the books that held her attention. In the center of the room, on a series of long, climate-controlled tables under focused, low UV lighting, were the patient casualties. Dozens of them. Journals bound in flaking leather, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon, diaries whose pages were the color of weak tea and just as fragile. She could see the damage from across the room. The ink was fading. The paper was brittle and acidic. Some pages were crumbling at the edges. This was a graveyard of memories, and it was the most beautiful and tragic thing she had ever seen. "This," Caius Thorne said, his voice a low rumble in the hallowed silence, "is my collection. My real collection." Linnea drifted forward, drawn by an invisible current. She stopped at the edge of one of the tables, her eyes scanning the elegant, spidery script on an open journal page. The language was a dialect of Italian she hadn't seen since her doctoral studies. 16th century. She looked up at him. "These are personal effects." "They are," he confirmed. He had not moved from the doorway, as if reluctant to enter the space. The shadows clung to him there, a sentinel's cloak. Memoirs, letters, diaries. The oldest is from the late Roman Republic. The newest is from the trenches of the Great War. Linnea's mind spun. The historical value was incalculable. It was a treasure beyond any museum's wildest dreams. "But they're degrading," she whispered, her professional diagnosis automatic. "The paper is consuming itself. The ink is oxidizing. Some of these are at the point of no return." "I know," he said. The words were heavy with a grief that felt ancient. I have had the best chemists, the best technicians. They have tried to stabilize them. They use sprays, chemicals, encapsulation methods. They treat the symptoms, but they do not understand the soul of the material. They handle them like specimens. They accelerate the decay. He finally moved, stepping fully into the room. The overhead lights, which had been steady, flickered violently for a moment before settling again. The air grew colder still. And he paused, and for the first time a fissure of something raw and vulnerable appeared in his marble facade. I cannot touch them. My own nature is anathema to them. The energy in me, the cold, it leaches the life from them faster, like a frost on a fragile leaf. He looked at her, and the full, devastating truth of his request landed on her. This wasn't a job. It was a plea. I did not hire a conservator, Linnea, he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. I sought out an artist, a necromancer for paper and ink. I have watched you for 6 months. I have read your papers on non-invasive restoration. I saw what you did with the letters of Eleanor of Aquitaine. You don't just preserve. You listen. You understand. He needed her to save his ghosts. The full weight of his being, the unnatural cold, the flickering lights, the crimson in his eyes, it all clicked into place. The whispers, the legends. He was something other, something ancient and powerful and trapped by his own nature. He was a king in a world of mortals, but he was powerless to save the only things that truly mattered to him. Would you have stayed when you realized the job was to save the personal diaries of an immortal creature who could not touch his own past? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Linnea looked from his haunted, timeless face to the dying memories on the tables. She thought of her 30 years in a sterile museum, fighting for budgets, for proper lighting, being told her work was a quaint hobby. She thought of the cheap card and Julian's smug, dismissive smile. All her life she had cared for the remnants of strangers. These were his. This was his life, his losses, his history, laid bare and turning to dust. Why? She asked, her voice soft. Why these? Why are they so important? They are the only proof that they existed, Caius said, and the sorrow in his voice was an ocean. They are the only proof that I did. In that moment, he was not the formidable Caius Thorne, magnate and mystery. He was not a monster from a dark legend. He was just a man who was afraid of being forgotten, a man who was losing everyone he had ever known for the second time. First to death, and now to decay. Linnea felt a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It was the same feeling she got when she held a letter from a soldier who never made it home. A connection across time, a duty to memory. I'll need a phase contrast microscope, she said, her voice steady and professional again, a shield against the overwhelming emotion of the moment. A clean room with humidity controls, deionized water, and Japanese tissue paper, a lot of it. A slow, faint smile touched Caius Thorne's lips. It was the first she had seen, and it transformed his severe face, hinting at a beauty that was both breathtaking and dangerous. The shadows around him seemed to recede, just a fraction. You will have it, he said. Anything you require. And so her new life began, not in a sterile lab, but in a Gothic library at the top of the world, in the service of a man who was older than the books he treasured. The days and nights bled into one another. Caius had a suite of rooms prepared for her in the main part of the house, a space of quiet luxury with a window that looked out over the sleeping city. But she spent most of her time in the library. It became her sanctuary, her workshop, her world. Caius was true to his word. Within a day, a team of silent, efficient workers had converted an adjoining room into a state-of-the-art conservation studio, built to her exact specifications. Anything she requested, no matter how obscure or expensive, appeared within hours. He never entered the studio. He respected its sterility. But he would spend hours in the main library while she worked, sitting in a large leather armchair in the shadows of the mezzanine, reading from one of the few books stable enough to be handled. He was a silent, watchful presence. At first, it was unnerving. She would be deep in concentration, carefully humidifying a brittle page, and she would feel his gaze on her. She would look up and see him there, utterly still, a sculpture in the gloom. But his presence was not menacing. It was attentive. No one had ever watched her work before. At the museum, her lab was in the basement. She was left alone, forgotten until something was needed. But Caius watched with a focus that was almost reverent. He watched her hands, her process, with the intensity of a scholar studying a sacred text. He learned her rhythms. He knew when she was too absorbed to eat. A tray would appear silently on a table near the door, with a simple, elegant meal. He knew when she worked late, and the library would be warm. The chill that always accompanied him held at bay. A cashmere shawl would be draped over the back of her chair, soft and smelling faintly of cedar and cold night air. They began to talk. It started with the work. She would explain her process, and he would listen, asking sharp, intelligent questions. He wanted to know not just the how, but the why. Why one type of paper survived and another did not. Why a certain ink faded to brown and another to gray. Then the conversations deepened. She was working on a series of letters from a young woman in 18th century Paris. The handwriting was full of life and wit. She must have been very charming, Linnea murmured one night, looking up from her magnifying glass. Her name was Annalise. She writes about the theater and the ridiculous fashions at court. From the shadows above, his voice came, soft and laced with memory. She was. She had a laugh that could make the chandeliers tremble. Linnea froze. She looked up at him. He was not looking at his book. He was staring into the middle distance, his eyes seeing a place hundreds of years away. He had spoken in the past tense, but with the intimacy of a recent memory. She didn't question him. She didn't act surprised. She simply accepted it, as she accepted the cold that radiated from him. She felt a pang of sadness for the girl, Annalise, and for the man who remembered her laugh. Her letters are full of light, Linnea said gently. I will make sure they last. A deep, profound silence filled the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. Thank you. That night, she found the journal. It was small, bound in dark blue leather, the pages filled with a tight, controlled script in Latin. It dated from the late 17th century. The subject matter was dense, philosophical. But tucked into the back, on the final few pages, the script changed. It became looser, more emotional. It spoke of a wife named Iona. It spoke of a fever that swept through their village. And it spoke of holding her as she died, her warmth fading, leaving him in a world that had suddenly gone silent and cold. Frigidus in aeternum, cold for eternity. Linnea read the last line, and her own eyes filled with tears. She understood now. The cold was not just a physical property. It was a memory. It was grief made manifest. She looked up toward the mezzanine. Caius was not there. She felt a sudden draft and turned. He was standing in the doorway of the library, his silhouette stark against the light of the corridor. He had seen what she was reading. His face was a mask of pale, desolate tragedy. The shadows around him were agitated, writhing like smoke in a wind. She didn't look away. She didn't pretend she hadn't seen it. She stood up, her heart aching for him, for the centuries of loss he carried within his frozen heart. She walked toward him. "Caius," she said, her voice a whisper. He didn't move. He looked like a man braced for a blow. He expected fear or revulsion. He expected her to run. She stopped just before him. She didn't say she was sorry. The words were too small for a grief so vast. Instead, she reached out and gently laid her hand on his forearm. The cold was shocking, intense. It was like touching a piece of iron left out in the deepest part of winter. It stole the warmth from her skin instantly. But she did not pull away. She left her hand there, a small point of human warmth against his eternal winter. "It must be so heavy," she said softly. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and a tremor went through him. His crimson-flecked eyes met hers, and they were shimmering with a pain so profound it was almost physical. For the first time, he let her see past the control, past the centuries of solitude, to the man frozen in a moment of unbearable loss. He slowly raised his own hand and covered hers. His touch was an impossible cold, a cold that spoke of tombs and starless nights. But under it, she felt that same tremor, a vibration of life, long dormant. "Less now," he breathed. The words were barely audible. It was a confession, an admission. Her compassion, her simple human touch, had lessened a burden he had carried for over 300 years. The moment hung between them, fragile and sacred. The world narrowed to the touch of their hands, one warm and alive, the other impossibly cold, but reaching for that warmth. He did not let go, neither did she. This intimacy, this quiet and profound connection, changed everything. The work continued, but the space between them was now charged with an unspoken tenderness. The silence was no longer just watchful. It was companionable. He started spending more time on the main floor of the library, not in the shadows above. He would sit and watch her, and sometimes he would talk. He would tell her about the people who had written the words she was saving. He spoke of a Roman senator who debated Cicero, a Renaissance artist who starved in a Florentine garret, a soldier who dreamed of his English garden from a muddy trench in France. He spoke of them like old friends. Linnea, in turn, found herself opening up to him. She told him about her quiet life, her lonely passion, her feeling of being out of step with the modern world. She confessed her hurt and humiliation at the hands of the museum. "They saw my work as a liability," she said one evening, carefully repairing the spine of a small book of poetry. "Old things, taking up space." "They saw treasure and called it dust," Caius countered, his voice low and fierce. "It is the curse of the short-sighted. They cannot see the value in anything that has endured." His defense of her life's work, was a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw. In his world, her skills were not a liability. They were a miracle. In his eyes, she was not quiet or invisible. She was essential. This growing closeness was not lost on the outside world. Tongues began to wag. A mousy, retiring archivist, fired in disgrace, was now living in the cliff-top fortress of the city's most reclusive and powerful billionaire. The tabloids and gossip sites went into a frenzy, and Julian Croft, humiliated and furious, saw his chance for revenge. The story broke on a Tuesday. It was a slick, vicious piece of journalism, quoting an anonymous museum source. It painted Linnea as an unstable, grasping woman who had faked her expertise. It claimed she had a history of erratic behavior and suggested she had somehow blackmailed or tricked the eccentric Mr. Thorne. The article's centerpiece was a quote from Julian himself, oozing false concern. "We were worried about Linnea's stability for some time," he was quoted as saying. "Her outburst at the farewell party was the final straw. We hope she is getting the help she needs." The attack was cruel, personal, and devastatingly public. It was designed to destroy her professional reputation and cast her as a madwoman, isolating her from Caius. Linnea saw it on a tablet that morning, her breakfast growing cold on the tray. The words hit her like a physical blow. The old shame, the feeling of being small and worthless, came rushing back. She was standing by the great glass window, staring out at the rain-swept city, when Caius entered the room. He did it so silently, she only knew he was there because the air grew cold. He said nothing. He simply came to stand beside her, holding his own tablet. He had seen it. "Linnea," he began, his voice dangerously soft. "It's what they've always thought," she whispered, not looking at him. "That I was strange, obsessed with dead things. That I didn't belong." "Look at me," he commanded. The softness was gone, replaced by steel. She turned. His face was terrifying. The mask of calm control was gone, and what lay beneath was an ancient, predatory fury. His eyes were no longer just flecked with crimson. They were solid red, two burning coals of incandescent rage. The shadows in the room writhed and coiled around his feet like enraged serpents. "This," he said, his voice a low, lethal growl that vibrated in her bones, "will be undone. The man who did this to you will learn the meaning of the word redundant." She could feel his power, a raw, elemental force straining against his control. It was the power to unmake a person, to erase them from the world as easily as she could erase a pencil mark, and it was all aimed at protecting her. But as she looked at his furious, beautiful face, she felt not fear, but a surge of her own strength. He had shown her she was not invisible. Now she would not act like it. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You will not hide me away and fight my battles for me. I am not a fragile page you need to protect in a box." His rage faltered, replaced by stunned surprise. The crimson in his eyes lessened, swirling back into the darkness. "He attacked my name," Linnea continued, stepping closer to him, her resolve hardening. "My work, my life. I will be the one to answer him. I will not be a damsel in your castle, Caius. I will stand beside you, in the light." He stared at her, and the look in his eyes shifted from rage to something far more profound. It was awe. It was reverence. In her defiance, in her refusal to be a victim, he saw a strength that matched his own, a queen to stand beside a lonely king. "As you wish," he said, his voice filled with a deep, resonating pride. "Then we will answer him together." The Abrel Museum was hosting its annual Benefactors Gala 2 days later. It was the society event of the year. Julian Croft would be there, preening and accepting praise for his bold new vision. It was the perfect stage. Caius made a single phone call. The press was alerted. There would be a special announcement from the Thorne Foundation. Linnea spent the next 2 days not in fear, but in preparation. She selected her weapon, not a sword, but knowledge. She compiled a dossier, a detailed analysis of the Verili fragment, complete with spectrographic data proving the ink's decay under the museum's lighting, and a list of a dozen other priceless artifacts similarly at risk due to neglect and improper care. On the night of the gala, she stood before the mirror in her suite. Caius had had a dress delivered. It was not a ball gown. It was a simple, elegant sheath of dark gray silk that fell to the floor. It was the color of a storm cloud, severe and beautiful. It was a dress for a woman going into battle. Caius came to her door. He was in a black tuxedo, a figure of stark, formal power. He held a velvet box. "For tonight," he said. She opened it. Inside, nestled on black satin, was a necklace. It was a single, large, teardrop-shaped black diamond hanging from a delicate platinum chain. It was a piece of the night sky, cold and brilliant. He lifted it from the box, his cold fingers brushing her skin as he fastened it around her neck. The diamond lay against her throat, cool and heavy, a piece of his world, resting against her mortal warmth. "They will try to look away from you," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "This will not let them." They arrived at the museum not in the black sedan, but in a car that made a statement, a vintage silver Bentley that whispered of old money and untouchable power. The press was a frenzy of flashing lights. Caius stepped out, and the crowd surged. But then he turned and offered his hand to Linnea. As she emerged, a collective gasp went through the reporters. This was the mousy archivist, this elegant, formidable woman with a storm-colored dress and a heart of darkness at her throat. They walked into the gala, and the effect was the same. The music seemed to stutter. Conversations died. Every eye turned to them. Caius, a dark god in a tuxedo, and Linnea, his unexpected, unreadable queen. She saw Julian Croft across the room. He was holding a glass of champagne, his face a comical mask of shock and dawning horror. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost walk back into the room, wearing the crown jewels. Caius led her to the very dais where she had been dismissed. He tapped the microphone, and a sharp feedback screech silenced the entire hall. "Good evening," he said, his voice amplified, washing over the crowd like a cold wave. "I will be brief. There have been some malicious and unfounded rumors circulating regarding a member of my foundation. I am here to correct the record." He stepped back and gestured to Linnea. This was her moment. She stepped forward, her dossier in hand. She felt Caius behind her, a silent mountain of support. She was not afraid. She looked out at the sea of faces, found Julian Croft's, and held his gaze. She did not raise her voice. She did not sling accusations. She simply spoke the truth. She laid out the facts of the Verili fragment, her tone crisp and academic. She detailed the chemical composition of the ink, the lumens of the lighting, the projected rate of decay. She presented her findings with the cold, irrefutable clarity of a scientist. She dismantled Julian's reputation not with anger, but with expertise. She proved, in front of the museum's wealthiest benefactors and the city's most influential people, that he was not a visionary. He was a negligent fool who was destroying the very art he was entrusted to protect. When she finished, the silence was deafening. She had not just defended herself. She had exposed the incompetence at the heart of the institution. Then Caius stepped forward again. "Miss Linnea Vance is not merely a member of my foundation," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "As of this week, I have created a new permanent position. She is the director and chief curator of the Thorne Archives, a private institution dedicated to the preservation of World Heritage artifacts. Her budget is unlimited. Her authority is absolute. This museum," he added, with a dismissive glance around the room, "was lucky to have her. Her dismissal was an act of gross professional malpractice for which this board will be hearing from my legal team." He let that hang in the air. A death sentence. He then looked directly at the stunned board members and finally at Julian Croft, whose face had gone the color of ash. "And any individual who has slandered her name will find that the world can become a very cold and very lonely place." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the chilling finality of a predator. He was, she realized, a true vampire king, not for what he took, but for what he protected. He then held out his arm to Linnea. She took it. Together they turned and walked out of the gala, leaving the ruins of her old life and Julian Croft's career behind them. Months passed. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Julian Croft was fired. The museum issued a groveling public apology. The Thorne Archives became the most talked about and respected private collection in the world, with Linnea as its revered, enigmatic head. She had never been happier. Her life had a purpose that resonated in her very soul. She and Caius were a team. They worked together, ate together, and spent long, quiet evenings in the library, the space now filled not with sorrow, but with a peaceful, shared intimacy. The cold that emanated from him no longer felt like winter. It felt like home. It was the cool, quiet stillness of his love. One night, she finished the last of Annalise's letters. She had saved them. The pages were stable. The ink was vibrant, the wit and charm preserved for centuries to come. She looked up to find Caius watching her, a soft, genuine smile on his face. "You've given them a voice again," he said. "It was always there," she replied. "I just made sure it wouldn't fade." He came to her, taking her hand, his cold fingers lacing with her warm ones. He drew her to her feet and led her to the great glass wall that overlooked the city. The lights twinkled below, a galaxy of mortal lives, burning brightly and briefly. "Do you ever wonder about time, Linnea?" he asked quietly, his eyes on the city, but his thoughts on her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, unafraid of the cold, unafraid of the shadows that danced at his edges, unafraid of the ancient, powerful being he was. He was hers, and she was his. She had spent her life preserving the past. He was offering her a future she had never dared to imagine. She looked at her reflection in the glass, at the woman she had become, strong, seen, and loved. Then she looked at the timeless man beside her. "No," she said, turning to face him, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "I don't wonder about time anymore. I only wonder about ours." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of ancient stone, of starlight, and of a love that had waited centuries to be found. It was not the end of her story, or of his. It was the beginning of theirs. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers centuries of cold, and where being dismissed by the world becomes the reason you are chosen, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.